Hey everyone, welcome back to another session of the Photo Hour. Good to have you here. We're going to be talking about Lightroom editing today, which is good. Covering a few sort of basics. We're not going to get super involved into things, but I'm going to sort of show you, I suppose, what I consider to be essential editing when it comes to Lightroom. There are definitely a few tools that I use more than others, so we'll have a little bit of a look through that, and I'm also going to talk about sort of workflow, I guess, and what is considered to be good workflow when it comes to editing videos. Just to remind you, we're open today from 11 till 4. This is the last day that we'll be open before the long weekend for Easter. If you'd like to come and shop, you're welcome to. They'll be encourage you to shop online, and you're welcome to give us a call or chat to us online at any time. I do have the number here somewhere. Here we go. 96722222 is that number if you want to give us a call. So, without further ado, let's get into Lightroom for today, and I'll swap over to my computer in a second and we'll have a look at some actual photos. But firstly, let's talk about what Lightroom is. Lightroom is image editing software and also an image organization software. You may have heard of it before. If you haven't heard of Lightroom, you've likely heard of its cousin, Photoshop. Both of these programs have a lot of use in the world of photography, and they're likely to be considered the industry standards. There are a couple of other programs out there that are useful and versatile as well, but majority of people will be using Lightroom, Photoshop, and a combination of the two. Now, we're going to be focusing on the editing side of Lightroom mostly today, and I've got a few examples for us to go through to show you some of the different editing tools. You may have used them, you may not have before, but a large portion of Lightroom is organizing your photos as well. And we can do things like add keywords, put photos in collections, and the reason why that's really useful is that down the track when you've got, tens of thousands of photos, hundreds of thousands of photos maybe, it makes it a lot easier to actually go back and search through your back catalog using a program like Lightroom rather than your normal sort of Finder or File Explorer that you'd have as default for viewing files on your Mac or your PC. The other thing Lightroom's good for is that we can look at raw files. I have noticed that you've been able to do that more recently in Windows and Mac, but historically you couldn't see thumbnails for raw files and that sort of thing in those systems. You had to use specialist software like Lightroom. Now, the other reason why Lightroom's really good is that it's non-destructive, and this is something that's a little bit different to Photoshop, because you used to have to be a little bit careful in Photoshop when you were editing, because it was very easy to overwrite your original photo and ruin it forever. We can't do that in Lightroom. In Lightroom, it has this non-destructive editing. So what we're going to be doing is editing our images, but we're never actually changing the original file. What we're doing is creating a secondary file that sort of gets overlaid on top of the original photo. And that file has all our edits, all our adjustments, as well as things like the keywording and collections and all that sort of thing as well. So the good thing about Lightroom is that if you change your mind and you decide you don't like the way you've edited an image, you can always go back to the original photo, back to square one again, and nothing is lost. The other thing that Lightroom is really useful for as well is that it does integrate with Photoshop. So if you are using a combination of the two, you can sort of go back and forth between them. There are definitely a couple of things that I still mostly use Photoshop for. Blending images, extensive cloning and healing, definitely do that in Photoshop. Plus a more sort of other, I guess, niche or more involved sorts of edits. But I try and have a majority of my work done in Lightroom because it's quicker and easier, and it means that I can batch process images really easily. So when I shoot a job, I don't want to be opening up each individual image in Photoshop, doing an edit, and then saving it, because it just takes forever. And Lightroom takes a lot of that sort of headache out of it and really streamlines the workflow to make things easier when you're editing a lot of images. The first thing we're going to talk about before we jump into Lightroom, though, is monitor calibration. And this is a really important one, because if you don't calibrate your monitors when you're editing your photos, you're basically just guessing as to what you're doing. And we really want to have more consistency, more precision when it comes to editing our photos, particularly if we're going to go put them online or get them printed. There's nothing worse than having a photo, going and sending it off to the printers and getting it back, and all of a sudden the photo looks completely different to how it looked on your screen. Now, likely the printer has calibrated systems. So most of the time, the problem is on the user's end when that happens. But if we calibrate our monitors, it gets us in the right ballpark so that when we start editing and we send our photos off to be used at a later stage, we're getting much more consistent results. Calibration always comes down to trying to streamline your workflow in a sense that my screen is calibrated to the printer's screen, is calibrated to my camera, and all this sort of stuff. It never gets it completely perfect, but it gets us in the right ballpark. So I'm going to run you through, I'm just going to calibrate my monitor quickly. I'm actually going to calibrate this one here next to me, which is a terrible monitor, I got to say. I have quite a nice editing monitor at home. This is just one that I had lying around. But we're going to calibrate it, and then we're going to do some editing on it, because at the moment I can tell you just off the bat, it's way too bright. Every time I look at photos on here, they look absolutely terrible. So we're going to try and tidy this up a little bit. Now, I've got a Color Monkey display calibrator. I'd say this is sort of like a low to mid-range calibration unit. What I actually do is, you might be able to see it here. So this little thing has a sensor in it, and I lay this over the top of the screen, and what that does is it looks at some light that the program is going to run through, looks at some different colors, and the sensor works out any discrepancies between the colors that it's seeing on the screen and what those colors are meant to be, and it'll create a custom profile for that screen for me. So let's pop over to my screen here, and we'll have a look and see how we go editing this terrible monitor that I've got next to me. Alright, so I've already got the program opened up here. I'm just going to minimize Lightroom for a tick and pull that over. And what we're wanting to do is profile my display for today. So I'm going to click onto that. Run me in here. The LG display is my laptop display, so that's not the one that I'm wanting to calibrate. I calibrate my laptop relatively often, maybe every 1 to 2 weeks. Monitors do shift over time, so you can't just sort of calibrate them once and have them sort of stay that way forever. You've got to do it every so often, and the programs often remind you. It can get a little bit annoying sometimes, but they often remind you when you haven't been monitoring and calibrating your monitor regularly. So let's do the Acer monitor. I'm going to click that one. I'm going to go to advanced. This lets me choose my white point. I'm happy with D65, happy with luminance of 120 as well. I would say most of us have screens that are way too bright, and this is particularly prevalent when you print. Photos look fine when you're looking at them on the screen, and then you print them and all of a sudden they look really dark. So that's normally because screens are way too bright. On that note, actually, I will say it's good to think about what your output is when you are doing calibration and editing. If you're sharing photos mostly online, then you want to be making sure you're editing for the online experience. And I would say that most people have their screens too bright. So in that case, you might need to increase that brightness level when you're calibrating your monitor. If you're calibrating for print, then it's a different story. You want to make sure that it's going to match the paper. And there's this different relationship between screens and prints. So screens have light that shine through them. They're often brighter and more contrasty. And paper, light bounces off that, so it's a different sort of viewing experience. I can see a couple of questions coming through. I'll get to them at the end, but thanks for, if you have any questions, just put them in the comments and I'll be able to answer them once we're done with the whole sort of stream. Okay, so I'm not going to optimize my ambient light for today just to simplify this process, but this calibrator here does actually measure the color of the light in the room as well. It's asking me just to take the cap off the sensor here. All right, so you'll see there, it's got a place on the screen where it's asking me to put this calibrator. And I'm just gonna hang that over the top. It's got a little weight at the back, which keeps it in place. You're not gonna be able to see that from your end looking through the camera here, but I've placed the sensor over that little marker there. And now I'm just gonna hit next. And what this will do first is run through a contrast and a brightness test. So immediately I know this screen is going to be too bright, so I'm going to have to adjust this myself. Now, it's a pretty heavy-handed way of adjusting this particular screen here, so we'll see how close we can get to that desired luminance level, but better than nothing at the very least. All right, let's see what it's doing. The whole process takes about maybe 5 minutes for this particular calibrator here. You do get different levels of calibration. So, you know, I think this calibrator here maybe cost me about $200 or $300. They go all the way up to $800 depending on what sort of level you want. But, you know, you can find them for cheaper than that too. The way I think about it is that anything is better than nothing. All right, I'm going to click left here. Okay, this is the brightness level that we're waiting for. And where is it saying? So you can see here, this is where we are, this yellow line. This is contrast, so we're way too contrasty at the moment as well. I'm going to jump into my menu here. And I don't think you're going to actually be able to see this on your end, but I've got some little buttons at the bottom of the screen, and that's just sort of like ticking through all the different options. Let's wind this contrast down. Oh, now it's saying we're too high. Yeah, so this is one of the problems because I've got this this way that it's reading the sensor and my menu options are over the middle of it. It is getting in the way a little bit. But anyway, we'll work around it. As always, you know, I haven't done that many tests beforehand, so there's always bound to be a few little problems that come up as we go. And we'll see if I can get that next. All right, brightness adjustment, that's the one we want. So way too bright. So let's go in and change that and see where it wants us to be. Now, I don't think this will really come through on your end either, so you're just going to have to take my word for it that I'm doing adjustments here. At the moment, my screen's on 100% brightness. I think that's going to need to be somewhere down around about 50%, I reckon. Let's push this down. And it's saying we're at 150 at the moment. Let's keep going down. And we're starting to get close. Oh, here we go. 124, 121. Okay, so I'm at 40. I was at 100 before for my brightness. So huge difference between what my screen was set to a default to what it should have been. And this is for print mostly, this brightness level. All right, let's hit next again. And what it'll do now is it's going to scroll through a number of different colors, different hues, different luminances, and that's just how it's going to work out our color calibration for this particular screen. I'm just going to leave it up there for a second just so you can sort of see what's happening with the colors. So we're doing our reds at different luminances, then I'll do greens and blues, sort of focuses on the primary colors of photography. And this process will take approximately about 5 minutes. So this is doing our greens now, and you can watch this. Normally what I would do is just walk away from the computer at this time. All right, so we don't need to watch that happening. You're going to be able to see it just happening over here in the corner while I'm talking. Let's have a look at some of these questions while we're waiting for that calibration process to finish. We do have calibration tools at the shop, so if you want to know what we've got in stock, just give us a call or talk through that chat line and we'll be able to help you out depending on what your sort of price level is. Work for iPads. I don't actually know the answer to that question, Mel, but I'll have a look for you. I have a feeling it wouldn't because the display profiles are often baked into the display options of your computer. But I'm going to Google that once I'm finished the stream and I'll get back to you on an answer. The guides for settings you want screens versus prints, that's just something that I've come across really through practical sort of trial and error. The settings I've used just then are more for prints, and most of the literature that you'll find will be in regards to prints. I found that things to do with calibration people are slow to catch up with how we actually view images these days. So I would typically use a brighter bright point for screens, just assuming that my end user was going to be looking at things on screen as well. So at the very start of that calibration process, I could set my brightness point and I would bump that up to a higher brightness. Issues with color calibration between Lightroom and Photoshop. I'm guessing that there's possibly some differences of color maybe between the two programs. It shouldn't be the screen that's causing that, because the screen's going to be the same between both the actual programs. But one thing I would make sure is that you're editing in the same color space for both of them. Normally Adobe RGB would be the one to pick for those two. It could be that there's different color spaces between the two programs, and that's affecting the color depending on which one you open it up in. Do we ever run courses for other editing software? We don't at the moment. I mean, I've dabbled with the other software many years ago when I was more of a struggling artist than I am now. I'm happy to pay the $15 a month. I get plenty of use out of something of Lightroom and Photoshop. There are some other software suites out there. We are going to be running a video editing course soon, which uses some free software called Resolve. So that might be worthwhile having a look at if you're into video editing, but nothing at this stage on the free programs. Some popular ones are GIMP. If anyone's heard of GIMP, that's like an open source Photoshop. I used that many years ago, but haven't touched it anytime since. Photoshop actually have an online editor, which is kind of all right, just to have a bit of a fiddle around with and play. Not really for serious editing, but it lets you dip your toes in the water. I'm not sure what's available for Apple, because I actually use PC. So yeah, I can't help you there. Sorry, Mel. We're about a minute away from this calibration finishing off, so we're going to finish that off and then we'll get in to do some actual editing. Now, one thing I want to talk about before we get into the actual editing portion of things is what is the purpose of editing? And there are two trains of thoughts, or two approaches that I take when I'm editing photos. I'm either editing for realism or editing for fantasy. So realism and fantasy is two separate worlds. A lot of people have this idea that when we take a photo in our camera, we're getting a truthful reproduction of the scene in front of us. And that's simply not the case. And there are many reasons for that I don't want to go too much into detail now. It is one of my favorite topics to discuss though. But one of the ways we can edit our photos is to actually edit them to be more realistic to as they were when we were there standing in front of the scene. There are color management tools we can do that. So in my artwork reproduction work, I use a number of different tools to make sure that I'm capturing accurate colors. But it can also simply be, in making a sunset or a sunrise a particular color, maybe more orange or more pink, or increasing the saturation, or making the green slightly a different green. Because our camera manufacturers decide, they sort of choose, this is what red is, this is what green is, this is what blue is, and there's no universal sort of baseline for those colors. The manufacturers are just choosing them as they sort of see fit. So don't think that editing always means sort of telling fibs. It can mean editing for realism too. And the other side of that is editing for fantasy, which is just editing a scene so that it looks how you creatively want to interpret it to look. There's nothing wrong with that either. People have been doing it for hundreds of years. And all the stuff we're going to talk about today, people have been doing in the dark rooms using more physically time-consuming techniques, but you can do all this stuff in the dark room as well. I would find most of the time I'm sort of sitting somewhere between the two for my personal photos. So I want to create some element of realism, but I also want to have some sort of creative intention behind my edit as well. I find it's good to have a goal before you go in and start editing photos. You really want to have an idea as to what you're doing. You can fiddle around a little bit, and have a play with, and editing is a bit of a to and fro sort of thing. You're not necessarily going to choose the perfect numbers and the perfect settings straight off the bat, but it is good to have a bit of an idea. Okay, this is my focal point. This is what I want to bring out the most of the image. How can I edit this image in a way that it gets that to that goal? This calibration's finished now, so let's just pop back to my screen here and we'll quickly have a look at that. I could change the profile name here. Generally what I would do is create some sort of date, so maybe D65, and then what is it, 2020, April 9th. Had to check the calendar there, and hit next. Sorry, save, and then next. And what that'll do is create a profile which will be automatically loaded into this screen once we're finished with this color calibration process. Now, again, I don't think you're really going to be able to see the difference on your end because it's more of a physical thing with me actually looking at this screen. That's going to show us the sort of difference. But again, you can just sort of trust me that it's happening there. It is working in the background. It's quite amazing what a difference it makes, particularly with a screen like this here, which is a pretty rubbish screen to start with. I would assume that the colors are pretty far off. And it's sort of chugging along. There we go, finally saved. So I'm just going to verbally tell you what I saw happen then. It was too warm, the screen, and there was also some green in it, so it's made it a little bit more magenta and a little bit cooler. And I'm going to hit next to save that, and that's done, nice and automatically. It also gives you a bit of a before and after as well, so you can actually see what it looked like beforehand, what it looked like afterwards. And I'm just having a look. It does look like you can see that come through on the stream a little bit, I think, so you should be able to get a bit of an idea, but also way too bright, way too saturated, and way too contrasty before we calibrated it. If I'd tried to edit photos on this screen and sent them off to the printer, I'd be kidding myself. There's no way I'd get anything useful back out of that. All right, let's finish that off and let's jump into Lightroom. And hopefully my computer doesn't explode while we're doing this, because I think running the streaming software, running Lightroom, and running that calibration unit is causing it to chug along quite a little bit. Not responding. Come on, Lightroom. Fingers crossed, everyone. Is it going to work? Yep, we're coming along. All right, let's see how we go with the editing side of it. Hopefully we can get something usable. I'm just going to pack up that calibrator now too so I can actually see what's going on. All right. So this is our Lightroom screen if you haven't seen it before. I actually use quite an old version of Lightroom. I'm using a Lightroom 6 on this laptop. If you're using Lightroom CC, then you've likely got a slightly different looking interface, but to be honest, Lightroom's pretty much kept the same all the way up till, I don't know, Lightroom 2, I've had people come into my classes and it's still a similar sort of interface. So there are a few things I want to show you in here. Let's just start with the most basic thing of all, which is an exposure adjustment. So I'm going to pull up this photo here, which is of our little lizard. And man, it is really, really struggling now that I'm doing this stream. And going to develop here, and we'll see what's going on. Fingers crossed this is going to actually work. Let me try and close another couple of things down to see if I can free up a little bit of CPU for Lightroom here. Okay. Wow, this really does not want to work for us. Tell you what, tech problems, it doesn't matter how many times you test things never seem to go right when you actually come around to doing them. Thinking about it, what I want to show you today, if I can actually pull this up on my screen, is I want to show you just some basic exposure stuff. I want to show you the transform tool, which is really useful too, some black and white things, and also some localized adjustments as well, in particular dodging and burning, which is the most sort of useful tool I find for controlling how light falls within the image. Now, with this photo here, I don't know if anyone's really used Lightroom before. We have this auto button at the top here for exposure. And if I click that, Lightroom is going to try and edit this automatically for me. But I can tell you right now, it's going to do a pretty rubbish job. And you can probably see that on your screens. That automatic exposure adjustment doesn't look very good at all. I find what Lightroom does is it tries to stretch out the histogram from left to right when you're doing an automatic exposure. And if you remember from the other day when we were talking about histograms, we don't necessarily always want the histogram to stretch out like this. Histograms take on many different shapes, so depending on the mood that we're going for in our image, we'll either want darker or brighter tones or a mix. It really just do it to taste. So auto doesn't work very well. Let's jump out of this one here, go to another photo. Like everything, auto is never really a satisfactory result. So there are a couple of ways we can adjust exposure in Lightroom. One is the basic exposure slider, but we do have a couple of more, geez, this program is freaking out, a couple of more precise ways of adjusting exposure too, and that involves using the highlights and the shadows slider. So they let us adjust the brighter parts of the image without affecting the darker parts, or the darker parts of the image without affecting the brighter parts. The way that exposure works is it just affects all pixels equally. So it'll make the dark pixels brighter, but it'll also make the bright pixels brighter too, which doesn't work super well when we've got an image like this, which is a very contrasty photo, because what will happen if I increase my exposure here is we might be making this vase of flowers brighter, but we're also making the window outside brighter too, and that's a problem. You can see those big red blotches there. They're called my highlight warnings. I typically have these turned on all the time because this is Lightroom warning me that I've reached pure white. And again, if you remember from our manual exposure class the other day, we never want to reach pure white or pure black in our images. Now, the way to turn these warnings on is up here with these little triangles. I've got a triangle up to the top of my right hand side of the histogram. That's my highlight warning, and on the left hand side I've got another triangle. That's my shadow warning there. Okay, so I could turn the two of them on. The shadows give me a blue blob, the highlights give me a white blob. So in this case here, just doing a basic exposure adjustment isn't going to work. What we're better off doing in contrasty environments is, or contrasty scenes, is using these highlights and shadows slider. So if I want to make the vase of flowers brighter, what I would do is increase my shadows to make my shadows brighter, and just have a look at the histogram while I do that. What it's doing is it's shifting those darker pixels up to a brighter part of the range, but it's not touching the brighter pixels. It's leaving them alone. And that avoids the problem of losing data outside the window while still making this vase of flowers nice and bright. Now, I could bring those window pixels down a little bit too if I wanted to by making the highlights darker. What you want to be careful of though, you don't really want to bring your highlights all the way down and your shadows all the way up, because that creates a really weird looking image. I sort of call this effect the HDR effect, which you might have heard of that term before. You know, this was the sort of a cool look maybe 10-15 years ago, but it's getting a little bit kitsch now. You definitely want a little bit of contrast in your images to keep them looking natural. I find with editing it's all about subtlety. You don't want to, you can create things and direct things in particular ways, but you don't want it to look unrealistic. Alright, so shadows and highlights, I use them all the time. With probably every image I take, I use those shadows and highlights sliders. Really love them because they let me adjust particular parts of the image without affecting the opposite end of things. Let's go to the transform tool next, and this one's a really useful one for those who are keen on architecture and really like their straight lines. So I've got a photo here shot in the State Library. This was shot on one of our photo walks, the City Walk, and it's a little bit wonky. I'm not sure how easily you can see that, but what's happening is these lines here are converging inwards and the horizontal lines are converging inwards as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to straighten things up based on this 9 awning sort of column thing happening in the background here. That'll be nice and straight and it'll look quite a lot better. Now, the way to do that is to go down to the transform tools down the bottom here. I'm going to click on that to open it up. Fingers crossed my computer doesn't explode. And there are a number of different options down here that we can choose. The one that I use is this little thing up here. So this sort of right angle little icon. I don't typically do any of this stuff. Sometimes I'll use horizontal and vertical occasionally if I want to fine tune things, but this thing here is magic. What this lets us do is choose our horizontal and our vertical lines in the image. So I've got to find 2 places that I want to be horizontal and 2 places that I want to be vertical. In this instance, what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose this line up here, and I want to make sure I start in the same place and end up in the same place along that line. I'm going to choose this line down here for my second horizontal line, and then I'm going to use 2 sides, so along the side there and along the side here for my vertical lines. You've got to choose 2 for each, 2 for your horizontal, 2 for your vertical, because it needs those 2 in order to marry things up. Okay, so I'm going to click here, click and drag across, and I need to make sure that I end up on the same line on the other side. I'm going to do the same down the bottom here. Start somewhere around about there. It's a little bit too high. Click and drag across, make sure I end up in the same spot on that line. And as soon as I've released that second line, what Lightroom will do is adjust that transformation for me. You might have seen that happen straight away there. So I'm going to do the same thing with the verticals, click and drag, end up on the same line and release, and do it once more. Click and drag and release. Beautiful. So that's our nice straight architecture there. And I'll just flop between, this is before, all wonky, this is after. So you can see what a difference that makes. And this works really, really well. If you've got really sort of severe error where your lines are converging, you know, if you've taken a photo pointing up at some skyscrapers or something like that, you've got these really, really strong converging lines. It's quite amazing how much correction you can get out of that transform tool. I use it all the time when I'm photographing things like paintings, which are meant to be square, but often aren't square when you're photographing them. Super, super useful. All right, let's talk about black and white now. And we're at the half an hour mark, so I might talk about black and white editing, and then I'll talk about dodging and burning and localized adjustments. And that's one that we don't cover in the beginner's Lightroom class. It's more of an intermediate technique, but it's incredibly useful, hard to master, but once you sort of get it down pat, it can really change your images quite drastically. Now, there are a couple of different ways to change your image to black and white. My favorite though is simply to use the black and white button up here, and I'll show you why in a second. If I click black and white on this little button, what it's going to do is it's going to turn the image to black and white. I could desaturate it, but that wouldn't be as useful, which we'll see why in a tick. So I'm going to turn this into black and white, and at the moment it's quite a contrasting image in the sense that we've got this orange butterfly on very green leaves, and there's this definite definition between the two. What you see though, when we turn it to black and white, is we actually lose all that sort of contrast, because even though they were very different colors, they're actually very similar levels of luminance, similar levels of brightness. Now, this is why I love making images black and white that way, because after I've made it black and white there, I can go down to my black and white mixer. And what this lets me do is adjust the luminosity of particular color groups. So if I want to create a little bit more contrast in this image again, what I could do is maybe make my green colors a little bit darker. So those were the leaves, and I'm going to drag that to the left, and we'll see that adjustment there, and maybe a little bit more. Oh, too more far, I think. Somewhere about there, perhaps. And then I'm going to drag my oranges brighter, so the butterfly stands out a little bit more. So what a difference that's made. That's where we've ended up. This is where we've started. Pretty boring image, just doing a basic black and white conversion, but after doing a little bit of TLC in the color mixer there, it really brings back a little bit more of that impact to the photo. You can fiddle around with these things. You can actually use those color sliders when you're looking at color images as well. If I go back to, where did I sit here? Somewhere like this. So if I go back to my original color photo, you can affect the colors within the image using these sliders too. So I could change the hue, the saturation, or the luminance. Luminance would be the brightness of the colors. I've actually made a couple of adjustments here already. I think that's when I was fiddling around before the class. But I could make my oranges brighter, for example. If the greens were a little bit off, maybe the greens were too yellow or too blue, I could go into the hue and adjust the color of those leaves as well. So this is a nice way of adjusting the saturation or of the colors in your image without actually affecting every color, because often if you just do a sort of standalone saturation adjustment, so up here we've got our saturation slider, can very easily make the image look a little bit Willy Wonka using that, because all the colors are being saturated equally. You're better off going and sort of fine-tuning your saturation on particular color groups to either make parts of the image stand out or parts of the image sort of not stand out quite as much. All right, so the one last thing we're going to talk about is dodging and burning. So I'm going to pull up this photo here. This was shot on our zoo photo walk, these two lemurs. Just as a bit of a side note, it took me 10 minutes of waiting to get this photo. This lemur at the top here was sitting there with its eyes half closed. I said to the lemur in my head, close your eyes. I don't want it in between, but you can't obviously tell a lemur to do that, so you've just got to wait for it. And so I was sitting there waiting and waiting and waiting with the camera in my hand, and it was, you're getting leg cramps, the camera's getting heavy because you're using a big heavy lens, but if you're not there with your composition ready to go, with your camera focused, what happens when the lemur does open up its eyes? You miss the shot, and its eye was only open for maybe a second before it closed it again. So you've really got to be ready for those moments, particularly with wildlife stuff, because if you've missed it, you've missed it, and too bad, there's not much you can do to fix that. But what I want to show you in this photo is just what a difference dodging and burning has made. So I'm going to go and pull up the original image here now, and I'll put the two of them side by side so you can see where it started and where it finished. Now, I really love the moment that I've captured in this photo. I love the expression on the two lemurs' faces. You've got this nice eye up here that's open, this nice eye down here that's closed. But there are a lot of problems as far as the brightness and lighting of the image to start with. This corner down here is way too bright. And I found when I took this photo, my eye just kept ending up at this part, which is not what we want. I said at the start, you want to have a bit of a goal before you start editing your images. And really my goal in this photo is to bring out the relationship between these two animals. So I want to make sure that when we're looking at this photo, our eye is ending up in the middle here, and it's sort of going back and forth between their two faces. So the way that I do this is by using localized adjustments. And in Lightroom, that is our paintbrush tool. So let me go back to our edited photo. I'm going to go back to the develop module here, and we'll have a look and just, have a breather while we wait for my computer to catch up. But we'll see exactly how many pins and how many adjustments I've done. It's quite amazing. Let me open up my adjustment here. So that's this little icon, the histogram on the right hand side. And it should show me all my pins in a second, hopefully. There we go. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 different local adjustments I've made on this image. And all of those are brightness adjustments, with the exception, I believe there might be a saturation one up here as well to bring out a little bit more in the eye, but all those other ones are simply brightness adjustments. Painting in, either making parts of the image brighter or parts of the image darker, so that we're redirecting where our focus is when we look at this photo. Now, I think my computer is going to fall apart if I do the entirety of this edit here, but I'm just going to sort of show you what the process is so you can start having a little bit of a play around on your own photos at home. And I'm going to go back to the original photo here so I can do these edits. Now, typically the way you want to dodge and burn, and that's what we refer to when we're talking about brightening and darkening an image. You may have heard of that dodging and burning terminology before, but you want to do it in sort of small doses. You don't want to really just like layer on a -2 exposure adjustment to start with, because that can sort of start to look artificial. So typically what I would do is I'd say we're going to start with darkening this corner here, so darkening these arms. I go down to maybe -2, -3 in my exposure, somewhere around about there. It doesn't really matter so much because we can go back and adjustment. And what I would do is I'd adjust this flow so it was down to around about 5%. Now, what flow refers to is how much of that adjustment is being layered onto the image with each successive part. So like a paintbrush, you're painting on little bit by little bit, time and time again, and that lets you create a more natural transition from the adjustment. So I would start here and I would just click and hold and go back and forth like this over and over and over again. Now, you might not see a lot happening at this stage, and that's because we're trying to build this up subtly, and also probably because my computer's running a little bit slow. But I'm just going to do this for a second. Maybe 5 was a little bit too low. Let's bump it up to 10 over here. And what'll happen after you've done it for 30 seconds, a minute or so, you will actually start to notice quite a bit of difference. So just keep brushing that on. Keep brushing that on. Now, the things that I would want to fix in this photo, so this corner is one of the things that I would adjust. Also, the bottom lemur's eye is too dark, so what I would do is make that brighter using a localized adjustment instead. Typically what I do with animal eyes as well is I brighten them up about half a stop, so I go up to the upper lemur's eye as well and just brighten that up slightly to give it a little bit more sparkle. And then parts like the lemur's white fur here, the white fur there, the white fur there, the white fur down there, I would darken down a little bit because they're very bright and distracting. And I darken this edge here, that edge up there as well. What I want really is for this middle part of the image to be the brightest thing in that photo, because that means if that's the brightest, our eye is most likely to go towards that first. All right, let's just see what a difference this has made. I'll go to before and after. Not sure. Sorry, that's not the before I want. I want to go back down in my history and have a look at the brushstroke. All right, so a little bit of a difference, and it becomes a lot more obvious once we skip back and forth between them. But really, you just keep going like that. You know, it might take 5 or 10 minutes. You really got to massage it out the most, but over time, you will be able to make those adjustments. And if you want to make a brightening adjustment, say we want to brighten this eye up here instead, what I would do is I would click New to create a new brush. And then what I would do is I'd make a positive exposure adjustment. So rather than -2.5 or -3, I go up to maybe for an eye, I would go positive 0.5. And when you're doing things like eye, because you have definite sort of lines that you can edit around, typically wouldn't go and have flow at 10 or a very low number. I just put flow all the way up to 100 again, and I could very precisely paint in my adjustment around that eye. So I'll just show you what that quickly looks like there. I'm just going to click to the positives here for my exposure. That's going to be too much. Let's go down to, yeah, that'll be fine. I'll zoom in on the eye here. Go back in. And then what I would do is go down to the flow, and I whack this flow all the way up to 100% again. And then what I would do is probably reduce my feather. So take the feather down to around about there, and I could very precisely paint in my adjustment around that eye and not really worry about affecting the eyelid or anything. So you've got a fair bit of control when you're doing this. I'll probably add in a little bit of clarity to it, a little bit of contrast, just to make the pupil, the iris, and the catch light pop out a little bit more as well. And maybe add a little bit of saturation there too to exaggerate those yellows. A couple of other things I'll say before I finish up. Feather, that's really useful. Typically when I'm dodging and burning, I would have the feather set to 100% for doing that flow-based adjustments. If I'm doing something with precise edges, what I would do is have the feather very low. The feather controls how quickly the adjustment blends out into the surrounding environments. And another quick little tool for you as well is that it's actually very sort of clunky going back to these sliders here and adjusting the size of things. The hotkey to adjust the size of your brush when you're doing local adjustments is square brackets. So left square bracket makes things smaller, right square bracket makes things bigger, and then I think it is shift square bracket. Yes, shift square bracket changes your feather size as well. So you can actually adjust the size of the feather and the size of the brush without ever having to go to those slider tools over there. So we might leave it there for the time being. I'll just have a look and see. I can see another question there. Any tips regarding losing edges of your picture? That's a good question, Chris. You want to try and get the image as correct as possible when you're taking the photo, because what the transform tool is doing is it's stretching or squishing the images in, and particularly when it stretches the image out, what it's having to do is create new pixels. And we tend to try and avoid creating new pixels when we're editing our images, because it is likely that the program's not going to get 100% correct. The more pixels we need to create, the more likely we are to get image artifacts. So you will lose some of the edges of your image when you're using the transform tool. You can just sort of shoot a little bit wider, so a little bit more zoomed out when you're taking the photo in order to account for that, knowing that you're going to have to use the transform tool down the track. But you want to avoid using that transform tool as much as you can. Try and get things square when you're taking the actual photo. I think that's all the questions answered there. If you've got any though, I'll be talking for another minute or so you can add them in the comments section. But thanks for joining me again today. We're not going to run tomorrow because of Good Friday, but we'll talk again on Saturday, and we're going to be talking about abstract photography then, and launching a competition for you to participate in, which will be really fun. I'm going to spend probably the entirety of tomorrow taking some photos, so hopefully I'll have some nice examples to show you. Again, just want to say too that our shop is open. We're open from 11 till 4 today, though we are closed over the Easter weekend. However, we encourage you to shop online, so make sure you're shopping online. Phone number is 9672-2222. So give us a call if you have any questions regarding the calibration stuff that I was talking about today. And you're also welcome to send me an email at school@michaels.com.au. What else yeah, that's pretty much it. So hopefully you can have some bit of fun editing. Even if you don't have Lightroom, all the stuff we've talked about today is pretty general across all the editing suites, so you could use it in your specific editing software. But I'll see you next time. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Next course is at 2 p.m. Sure. Actually, it's good that you mentioned that, Mel. I'm not sure what's happening there. For some people, it's displaying as 12 p.m. For some people, it's displaying as 1 p.m. I've scheduled it for 12 p.m. on my end. It's sort of like it's stuck in daylight savings, or I think that glitches on Facebook's end. But it will be at 12 p.m. So all the courses are running at midday. If it says 1 p.m. on your notifications, then just ignore that. I'll keep looking into it, but I can't work out what's going on there. And also, I forgot to say too, we are doing online one-on-ones at the moment as well. I'll be at home over the Easter break, so if you'd like to organise a one-on-one to talk about something specific to your camera, we're doing it at a discounted price at $99 an hour, and they're working out really well. Just send me an email at school@michaels.com.au and I can organise a time for us to do that. All right, we'll leave it there.